Okay, then I guess we're beginning World Civ, guys. So today we are continuing our discussion of World War One and its beginnings. Yes, if you look at this, I'll pull that picture up in a moment. This is a picture of an artillery piece, which if you look on canvas, you'll be able to see on yourself. So, where should we begin? We begin here. This is where we left off. Roman numeral 3. This war, meaning the Great War, it was called the Great War because the world had never seen anything like it before. It involved 30 plus countries, and the scale was unheard of. As it says, millions upon millions of soldiers marched off to war, mostly in Europe, but also in Africa, also in Asia, of course, on the oceans. But they marched off to war amid expectations that this was going to be a grand adventure that would be won quickly. This is where you remember our film All Quiet on the Western Front, where Paul, the teacher, Paul von Hindenburg, said, "Yeah, you guys are going to go off camping trip with rifles. It's going to be fun." The war, however, is going to quickly become a stalemate, a bloody war of attrition. And the first thing we need to learn about is this thing called the von Schlieffen Plan. To understand it, let's look at a map of Europe, shall we? This map over here shows Europe prior to 1914. These are the countries, the pink are the countries of the so-called Central Powers or the Axis, and in the yellow, tan, these are the Triple Entente. Now, the country that was really in a difficult position in this war is Germany. Germany had the misfortune of having a major enemy on its eastern border, Russia, and a major enemy on its western border, that being France. And, it was, for Germany to defend itself, it would have to fight on two fronts. A tremendous disadvantage. No other country in Europe had that disadvantage. Where are we at? I'm back here. Yes. And so to do that, Germany came up with something called the von Schlieffen Plan. And what was the von Schlieffen Plan? The von Schlieffen Plan was based on the belief that of these two potential enemies, France and Russia, that the weaker of the two would be France, that France could be knocked out of the war quickly, like they did in the Franco-Prussian War. In the Franco-Prussian War, Germany knocked France down for the count in 6 months. And so Germany thought we could knock France out of the war. Russia, a much, much larger opponent in terms of manpower, but also a much, much slower opponent in terms of getting ready and getting mobilized. So the plan was knock these guys out of the war fast, turn and face these guys, and then eventually you could wear them down. Because Russia was kind of like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. Yeah. And so that was the von Schlieffen Plan. How did it go wrong? Well, so once again, the von Schlieffen Plan meant that the Germans were going to send, division after division after division into France through Belgium and penetrate far into France, knock them out of the war. And the other part of that plan was to send a holding force, one single army, the German Eighth Army, on the Eastern Front to face off Russia, given the belief that Russia would not be ready early in the war. And so, plan went into operation, and sure enough, it was working. The Germans were pushing, they literally got within 40 miles of the gates of Paris. In fact, we're planning on gassing the city of Paris. They were that close. And then the German Eighth Army, commanded by General von Hindenburg, finds itself faced by not one Russian army, but two, the Russian first and second. Well, the German army meets the first and second and actually defeats them both, smashes them, in fact. But here's the problem. The assumption of the von Schlieffen Plan was now kind of shattered. They did not believe that Russia would be able to put one army on the field, much less two. And so they were thinking, if the Russians can put 2 armies on the field, how many more can they put on our eastern border? How many more can they send into Germany itself? And so what the Germans did, they began taking division after division of soldiers off the successful Western Front, putting them on trains, shipping them across Germany to shore up the Eastern Front. Now, the problem with that was that the power, the thrust, the strength of this offensive here faded away. And so what Germany had to do was to hold on to the territory it got. The Germans dug a series of trenches, literally from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps. And since the Germans had dug in, the French and British also dug in. And World War One, instead of being this lightning quick war that the Germans, the von Schlieffen plan had envisioned, was now a war of attrition. You say, well, what's a war of attrition? A war of basically seeing who can take the most damage, who can survive the pounding. So, back to the matter at hand. The First Battle of the Marne was so important because that was where the French and British were able to stop the German advance. As it says there, Germany had now had what it did not want, and that was a two-front war of attrition along a set of trenches that stretched in the west from the Alps to the North Sea. Trench foot, we already looked at that on that film, very useful film. Trench foot, it's a disease that would quickly get infected and would cause amputation and or death. What was trench warfare like? Your worst nightmare. I mean, because you lived in trench warfare, you lived outside. Yeah, I mean, you dug a hole in the ground. There were some tunnels that some of the trenches had, but you could not warm yourself with a fire because a fire would emit smoke, or at nighttime it would emit a glow, which would make it easy for the enemy to target your position. And what was it like? Well, like I said, you were outside all the time. When it rained, the trench filled up with water. Water becomes mud. Mud becomes trench foot. And then there were rats, corpse rats. We saw them in All Quiet on the Western Front. How, they're going to be dead bodies lying out in the field. It can't be retrieved. And the rats came. And the rats stripped those bodies clean, Um, the population of rats quickly exceeded the population of soldiers on the front. And then, of course, there was disease. There was never enough food. And other times there were boredom. And so it was just terrible. I mean, watching that film give you some idea. Watching that film, All Quiet on the Western Front, gives you some idea of that. All Quiet on the Western Front, once again, is a work of fiction, and it is.
Attention, please, all students who ride bus 86, he's pulling into the bus loop. Thank you.
It's a work of historical fiction. I mean, there was no Paul Baumer, but there were millions of Paul Baumers. People who went off to war like that and suffered those kind of things. Now, between the lines of trenches was about a 500-yard space called no man's land. And in that space, there was nothing. It was not safe. There was all kind of mines, barbed wire, and then of course there was the things like machine gun fire. And so you stayed in the trench if you could. Ah, yes. Now the Christmas truce, that is something that is quite interesting. The Christmas truce occurred in the first year of World War One. The war got started only on July 28, 1914. Well, by the Christmas season, the soldiers who were at the front were so just sickened by this constant killing and being killed and shelling, and that they just wanted to feel human. And so at night, the soldier would sing Christmas carols back and forth. They would sing Silent Night. The Germans would sing it in German. The British would answer back in English. And eventually, somebody on one of the sides asked somebody on the other side, "Hey, Christmas, would you meet me? Would you come out and just meet me in no man's land on Christmas Day?" And sure enough, on Christmas Day, a German soldier emerged from the trenches, and he had in his hand a sapling of an evergreen tree. And he had taken candles and he had attached it to the tree, and they were lit. And there we walked across, and a British soldier began coming out, and more German soldiers, and they met in no man's land, and they started talking and laughing, shaking hands, and they traded things like tobacco and whiskey and wine and you know chocolate, things that soldiers might have, and they even got up a soccer game. No, seriously, they got up a soccer game between the two. The officers refereed. It lasted for a while, and then at the end of the day, they went back. Now, the problem with the Christmas truce was that it really hacked off the high command, because you can't have soldiers like each other on one day and then kill each other on the next. And so the high command of both sides got really hacked off. And not only did they forbid any further Christmas truces, but from that point on, every time Christmas came around, Christmas was a day of bombardments. And so, yeah. Were the trenches good protection from all weapons? Well, I mean, a direct artillery hit right into the trench would not be great. But the thing that all soldiers feared, as you saw in the film, All Quiet on the Western Front, was poison gas. Poison gas, both the chlorine gas and the mustard gas, which was worse, were both heavier than air. And instead of rising up, it would seek the lowest level, like the trenches or foxholes. And so if you were a soldier, you couldn't be down there. Because, yeah, you'd wear a mask, but sometimes the mask would leak. Or in the case of the mustard gas, it would burn, and it would stay in the hollows and in the trenches for quite some time before it finally dissipated. All right, weapons. Let's talk. This is a war that saw, mechanization take over. For example, the new and improved rifle. No longer did soldiers have to tamp, pour powder, tamp, fire, pour powder, tamp, fire, getting off maybe 3 rounds a minute. These new and improved rifles, a soldier could fire as fast as he could put a clip in. Normally, clips, and by the way, the rifles were bolt action, and so your clip had 7 rounds, and then you'd pop that clip out and put another one in for 7 more rounds, and that was pretty fast. And not only that, the rifle was more powerful. Yeah, no longer did these rifles, the shots veer off to the right or veer off to the left. It was powerful. And of course, poison gas. Like I said, there were two main kinds of gas. There was the chlorine gas, um, which is made by mixing ammonium and chlorine, ammonium chloride. Don't do it. Um, or the mustard gas, which was much worse. It was a more toxic gas, a more caustic gas. Uh, and it was, it would burn out the eyes, and the skin, turn the lungs into water. So, and then of course there was a machine gun. Yeah, the machine gun, a weapon that could fire 400 rounds a minute. A real machine gun that uh, the recoil of the weapon, when you fire it kicks back. A guy named Hiram Maxim developed a gun where it uses that recoil to pop the next shell up into the chamber. And it could fire 400 to 600 rounds a minute. 400 to 600 rounds of anything will cut human flesh in half. And the machine gun was just deadly. Yeah. Now, towards the end of the war, the British introduced a weapon that they told everybody it was a water tank, but sure enough, it was an armored vehicle. Many of which were kind of clumsy during the day, clumsy in the early stages. I'm gonna take a break. I'm gonna show you a tank. Hang on. And we are back. Yeah, I have a picture that I want to show you. This is an American tank. I took this picture in a museum. There's a museum in Kansas City. See, I'm an AP reader. I read AP exams, and the readings are held out in Kansas City. Well, one of the cool things about Kansas City, besides barbecue, is that it has the only World War One museum in the whole country. A museum dedicated strictly to World War One. It was built in 1920. This is an American tank. And you're wondering about the size of the tank. I was about as tall as this tank. This was a two-man vehicle. The driver sat here, and the gunner up would load the guns up here, and here was, of course, the escape hatch. But yeah, and it was a mobile weapon. And the tank, the interesting thing about the tank, it made trench warfare obsolete. Yeah, because no longer would hiding inside a trench protect you. The tanks would just roll over those trenches, and so yeah, that's a World War One version of a tank. They had their problems. Number one, can you imagine how hot it was in here? Riding around with a motor, or loud it was in here. Riding around with a motor, cooking you in the summertime, and two, they got stuck a lot. And once the tank gets stuck, you're kind of a sitting duck. But yeah, that is an American tank. The British built the first tank, looked nothing like this. But it's a weapon that really terrified the Germans, and the Germans are going to learn from their experience with the tank in World War One. And so yes, let's get back to this. Now, probably the weapon that was the most influential of World War One was the submarine. Mankind had been trying to create a ship that would go underwater since Alexander the Great actually went underwater in a diving bell back 500 years before the birth of Christ. Yeah, and but many of the experimentations with submarines up until about the 19th century had ended in tremendous failure. Most of them had. It was a very foolhardy task. In fact, even today, in our modern Navy, where submarines, don't run the risk of sinking as much as they used to, but a submariner in the United States Navy automatically receives a 15% pay upgrade because it is considered that his duty is that much more hazardous. But the submarines of World War One, quite interesting. I think I might have a picture of one of those too. Not sure. Let me hit the pause again, Horton. And once again, we are back. We're talking about submarines, were we not? Yes, let's look at a painting of a World War One vintage submarine. Yes, this is it. Notice the submarines weren't very big. Pardon me. And this is a German submarine approaching an American transport ship of the day. They weren't very big, and not only that, they weren't very sturdy, if you'll pardon me. Yeah, they weren't very sturdy, and so these submarines, when the Germans first developed them, and remember that the Germans developed submarines and put a lot of stock and a lot of money into submarines because for the simple reason that Great Britain had the greatest navy in the world. Yeah, the British had the best navy in the world. And the British could easily, let's look here at our map again. The British could easily, if you look here at Germany's coastline, for Britain it would be a very simple task to blockade and to keep the Germans bottled up in here. In fact, the British blockade during the war was so extensive. Let's go to another picture. That this happened. This is a picture from World War I, 1918, of people in the city of Munich. Notice these people are dressed in pretty nice attire. And what they're doing here, if you look, they are stripping. This is a dead horse, a horse that has died on the streets of Munich. And these people are stripping that horse for its meat. And by the way, the horse wasn't slaughtered, it died. What kind of people eat a dead horse that has died of some disease or starvation? Answer, people are pretty hungry. And the British were able to do that to the Germans through their blockade of Germany. The Germans counterpunched with submarines. Because if you look once again at the map, Britain also depended upon food coming into their country from the oceans. And what the Germans did, they used submarines to shut that food line down. The problem with the German method was that when the Germans did it, people died. You see, because what the British with their blockade do, they will just prevent you from entering Germany. They'd stop your ship, seize your cargo, but the people on board the ship, we don't want you. Get out of here. However, when the Germans ran up against the English shipping, they sank them. In fact, once again, let's pause a bit. I'm sorry. Pause. Come on, Horton. Here we go. One more. Now let's look at this poster that I saw also in this Kansas City World War I museum. That this poster right here. And I see this poster right here. You see all these red dots right here? These red dots represent the sinking of British shipping by German submarines. And you look, it starts all the way down here at the coast of France, all over here, all through here, just multiple sinking, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of tons of ships being sent to the bottom. And when those ships went down, remember, if you look at that picture, the picture seems to suggest that the submarines are taking on survivors. Submarines are small. They couldn't take on survivors. And so submarines would simply fire a torpedo into that ship's side and then just go off. The submarine would just slink off into the depths. And yeah, that would be it. So that was that. And now finally the airplane. Yeah, we'll finish this. Now, this is, of course, the first war in which airplanes played some role in. They didn't play a major role. They were more eye candy than anything else. As you know, Orville and Wilbur Wright up in Dayton invented the first airplane. And the first airplane was invented in 1904, the first successful flight of 282 feet. But 10 years later, they were being used for military purposes. Now, the first military aircraft, the airplane was at first used only for reconnaissance, meaning that the airplane, did I spell that right? That just looks wrong. The airplane is sent over the enemy's lines to look, see troop movements, fly back, give information. They didn't have radios. So they'd go fly over. In fact, when the first planes flew past each other as they're having finished or beginning their reconnaissance mission, the pilots just wave at each other, very friendly, no reason to kill each other. But as the war went on, it was figured out when the war came on, it was figured out that the information those pilots were collecting were costing people's lives. Well, this turned to this and then other bad signals. And eventually somebody got the idea of, hey, why don't we take a gun up in the plane? And at first that's what they took. They would take a rifle or a shotgun. And of course, you know where this is leading to. Somebody figured out how to mount a gun on the plane. Of course, that was tricky, because if you mounted it inside the circumference of the propeller, it would quickly saw the propeller off. And then there were devices like, for example, the British began mounting the machine gun on top of the upper wing of the biplane, and they fired it like that. But the Germans came up with a device that it had a cam in it. I don't know if you know what a cam is. It's a device that actually stops the firing pin, and so that when the propeller reaches the vertical like this, there's a device in the gun that halts the firing mechanism. And as the propeller goes around, it starts firing again, 700, 400 rounds a minute. And what happens then? You have your first aerial dogfights. Planes were also used as bombers, and the early bombers would do things like the first bombers, they simply carried a loaded potato sack full of bombs, and they would just drop them over the side. Of course, that was kind of not exactly accurate, but it's what they did. I mean, then they began, by the end of the war, they developed bomb bay doors and all those kind of things. And even with that, the bombers were not the most accurate in the world. But the airplane had made its way into war. I mean, made its way in. But really, like I said, it was more eye candy than anything else. I mean, flying a World War One airplane was quite an adventure. I'll try and remember to bring you a picture of that tomorrow. I flew in a double seater open cockpit plane many years ago. One of the coolest things I ever did in my life. I mean, yeah, it was a 1940 United States Army trainer plane. And, I'm telling you, flying in one of those things, you are really flying by the seat of your pants. I got into the pilot seat, and the other guy sat behind me. Both of the seats had controls because it's a trainer plane. And, as a pilot on one of these planes, all you had your joystick that you could turn right or left, and you had two pedals, rudders. No, I'm sorry, the joystick up and down. The the rudders, they could make your plane bank, and then all you had was an airspeed indicator, a dial, an airspeed indicator, how fast you're going. An altimeter tells you how high you are, and then over here you had a little lever, and I'm not even going to mess with that light. A little lever, and this lever told you, forget it, told you, well, it didn't tell you anything. The lever was a fuel mix lever, and you wanted a rich, in other words, more gasoline in your fuel mix if you were taking off, and less as you flew along, so that you would, conserve gasoline. And and that was it. And that was it. You didn't have any kind of location devices, no radar, nothing like that. You flew by looking for landmarks, and church steeple, a river, roads, for example. And yeah, in fact, if you would go up in the air, if the wind speed was higher than 10 miles an hour, that was a no-no. Flying at night, no-no. You didn't fly at night because you had to see to land. There were no lit airfields. But no, it was quite interesting. And those early World War One airplanes would just spew oil. The motor would just spew oil, and so you would wear a big leather jacket. You know, wear a big leather jacket uh, with goggles. You had to have goggles because if you get oil in your eyes, you're not seeing anything, and so you not only would you wear goggles, you'd be kind of like I don't know if you knew this or not, but horse racing jockeys wear multiple goggles. And after one set of goggles gets covered with mud, they simply peel it up and peel it up. And yeah, it was not as glamorous as you would think of. And so you needed to wear gloves because you oftentimes flew very high up in the air, and it was very cold. And like I said, it wasn't as glorious as you might think. And last but not least, airmen carried a revolver. Two things: a revolver and a hammer. The hammer was if the gun jammed, you would hammer it until maybe you could unjam it. The revolver was for this: if your plane was shot and you caught on fire, there was no jumping out with a parachute. Um, you were going to die one of two ways: by crashing and burning, or just by burning. And for many of those airmen, they preferred to take their own lives with a pistol. Why were casualties so high in this war? Well, basically because you have machines. This is the first war where machines, mass produced, played such a great part versus human beings, and they basically were applying old tactics to new weapons, and the weapons won. And yeah, the casualties were in the millions. As it says there, in the siege of Verdun, the Germans lost 300,000 soldiers, just like the French did. In the Battle of the Somme, each side lost 500,000 soldiers. And we know what the Western Front. The Western Front was the border of France and Germany, and that was a stalemate. The Eastern Front was the border between Russia and Germany, and the Russians were just terrible. The Russians were the worst soldiers of the war. And I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to stop here, and we shall pick up tomorrow.